The bird stopped singing first. Reed Calloway noticed that before anything else. He had lived long enough, and in enough dangerous places, to know that silence was never truly silent. Silence was always a message. The silver-barked trees at the edge of his property usually held a dozen kinds of noise at dusk. Thin whistling creatures that nested in the high branches, a low humming insect that came out when the light turned amber, the occasional call of something larger moving through the undergrowth. He had learned their rhythms the same way he had learned the rhythms of everything else in his long life, slowly, without trying, just by paying attention. Tonight, they were all gone. He was sitting on the porch in his old chair, the one with the cracked armrest he had never gotten around to fixing. His rifle lay across his knees, not because he expected trouble, but because cleaning it was something his hands knew how to do without him having to think about it. The cloth moved in slow circles. The evening air on Crestfall was cold and smelled like turned earth and pine like resin from the silver trees. Behind him, through the cabin wall, the low hum of the heating unit clicked on. He looked up at the tree-line. Nothing moved. That was the problem. Everything should have been moving, small things going about their small business at the end of the day. Instead, the trees stood perfectly still, as though they were holding their breath. Reed set the cleaning cloth down on the porch railing. He did not raise the rifle. He just looked. It took another few minutes before he saw it. Most people would not have seen it at all, because they would have been looking for the wrong thing. They would have been looking for a shape, for movement, for something that looked like a threat. Reed was not looking for any of those things. He was looking for the thing that did not belong, and what did not belong was the light. There was a faint glow at the edge of the trees. Soft violet, like a filament of color woven into the dark. It pulsed very slowly, the way a heartbeat pulses, and it was low to the ground. Reed looked at it for a long time. It looked back at him. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath through his nose. He picked up the cleaning cloth again and went back to what he was doing. His hands moved. His eyes stayed on the trees. Over the next few minutes, the violet glow shifted slightly. It moved to the left, then back to the center. It was testing something. Probably testing him, whether he would move, whether he would make noise, whether he would run. He did none of those things. He sat in his chair on his porch and cleaned a rifle he had already finished cleaning, and he let the creature in the trees understand that he was not afraid of it. That was the first thing. Not bravery, just the absence of fear. There was a difference, and animals always knew which one they were looking at. After perhaps 40 minutes, it stepped out of the trees. Reed had served in 3 wars, across 4 different planets, and he had seen things that men were not built to see. He thought he had a good sense of scale for danger. But when the creature moved into the open ground between the tree line and his yard fence, he felt something shift quietly in his chest. Not fear, but a deep and honest recognition that he was looking at something extraordinary. It was roughly the size of a large wolf, though longer in the body and heavier through the chest. Its legs were powerful, the kind of legs built for sudden speed, and each paw ended in talons that caught the last of the evening light. Its pelt was dark, so dark it was almost black, but where the light hit it, colors moved through it like oil on water. Deep violet, blue, the occasional flash of green. Along its sides and the length of its tail ran thin filaments that produced that faint bioluminescent glow, pulsing slowly, the way a living thing breathes. Its head was narrow and long, like a wolf's, but more refined. 2 sets of ears, one pair upright and pointed, the other pair fan-shaped and translucent, fanned wide now and alert. Its eyes were amber, and they caught the dim evening light and held it, so that even from 40 feet away, Reed could see them clearly. It was, without question, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was also clearly injured. The right rear leg moved wrong, slightly dragged, not fully trusted. One of the fan-shaped ears had a tear in it, ragged at the edge, the kind of damage that came from something sharp and recent. Its coat, which Reed suspected should have been vivid and bright, was dull in patches where the animal had not been able to care for itself. It had the look of something that had been moving for a long time without stopping. It stood at the edge of the yard and looked at him. Reed looked back at it. He spoke, not words with meaning, just sound, low and even, the kind of voice he had used in the field when a wounded soldier needed to hear that someone was there and was not panicking. He talked about nothing. He said that it was getting cold. He said the heating unit in the cabin was making that clicking noise again, and he ought to look at it. He said the coffee from that morning had been too strong, and he had not enjoyed it. He talked in a steady, unhurried river of sound, and he watched the creature's fan ears shift and tilt as it listened. After a while, its tail lowered. After a longer while, it took 3 steps forward, then stopped. The amber eyes did not leave him. He did not stop talking. Then, without any drama, its legs gave out. Not violently. It did not fall so much as lower itself, the way a very tired thing finally accepts that it cannot keep going. It settled onto the grass at the edge of the yard with its chin between its forepaws and its filaments dimming slowly to a faint, steady pulse. Reed stopped talking. He set the rifle aside, stood up from the chair, and went into the cabin. He came back with a bowl of water and the rest of the roasted meat from his dinner. A generous portion, the kind of portion he would have begrudged himself. He walked to within 20 feet of the creature, set both things on the ground, and walked back to his chair and sat down. The creature did not move. Reed crossed his arms and settled in. The cold came up around him, and he let it. He had slept in worse places than this, in worse conditions, in worse company. He watched the tree lean and listened to the nothing where the birds used to be, and he did not sleep. By the time the first pale light came across the amber plains to the east, the bowl was empty and the meat was gone. The creature was still there, lying in the grass, those amber eyes open and watching him with an expression that had no name in any language, because nothing had ever been close enough to a Vorkai while it was still breathing to give it one. Reed looked at it. The creature looked at him. He thought, well, that is something. Then he went inside to make coffee, because it was morning, and that was what he did. The child saw it first. Her name was Petra, and she was 8 years old, and she had absolutely no business being at the eastern edge of the colony at that hour, a fact she was very aware of and chose not to think about. She had been chasing one of the long-legged jumping creatures that lived in the grass near the fence posts. The colony kids called them hoppers, and catching one was considered a significant achievement among children under 12. She had been very focused on this goal. Then she looked up, and the goal stopped mattering. The man was Reed Calloway, who lived out past the last row of colony buildings in a cabin that most adults considered too far from everything and most children considered exactly the right amount of mysterious. He was walking his property line the way he did every morning, slow and unhurried, hands in his jacket pockets. This was normal. What was not normal was the thing that was following him. It was following him the way a large shadow follows a man in afternoon light, at a distance, loose and unhurried, as though it had no particular intention, but also no intention of stopping. It was dark and violet-sheened and bigger than anything Petra had seen outside of a picture, and its eyes, even from far away, glowed like 2 pieces of amber held up to the sun. Petra stood very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then she ran back to the colony at a speed that would have impressed her parents. By mid-morning, Harrow's Landing was in the kind of uproar that small frontier colonies are particularly good at generating. Total and immediate, spreading from person to person the way a fire spreads through dry grass, gathering detail and distortion with every telling. By the time the story reached the colony administrator, it had grown from one creature at the edge of Reed Calloway's property to a pack of them circling the settlement. And the administrator, a practical woman named Hadley who had managed this colony for 11 years, did something she had done only twice before in those 11 years. She opened a line to the GSA. The words she used in her report were careful and measured, because she was a careful and measured person. She said, possible Vorkai sighting, single specimen, Harrow's Landing settlement, planet Crestfall, Colonial Sector 7. She said it had not been aggressive. She said it appeared to be associating with a resident. The automated system that received her report flagged it in 0.3 seconds. It did not care about the careful, measured language. It cared about one word. Vorkai. In the Interstellar Hazard Codex, the document maintained by the Galactic Survey Authority to catalog creatures, environments, and phenomena considered dangerous to settled populations, the Vorkai held a Tier 1 designation. There were 17 Tier 1 designations in the entire codex. The Vorkai was the only one that came with a footnote that read, direct engagement not recommended under any circumstances. That footnote had been added after the incident at the Drovian mining colony on Ornivy's third moon. when a team of 42 soldiers from 2 different species went in to handle what was described as a containable situation, and 31 of them did not come back out. The alert moved up the chain in the time it took Hadley to pour herself a second cup of something hot and try to decide what to do about the 11 people already asking her questions outside her office door. Far above Crestfall's atmosphere, in the mid-range patrol corridor that covered Colonial Sector 7, Commander Yadaose was reviewing crew rotation schedules and deeply wishing he was doing something else. He was Delani, tall, copper-skinned, with a bifurcated crest along the top of his skull that flattened slightly when he was concentrating, the way another person's brow might furrow. He was competent and experienced and had handled 11 containment calls in 6 years of sector patrol, none of which had required anything more than a firm show of presence and a calm voice. Then the alert came through. He read it once, then again. Then he looked up at his bridge crew and said, in a voice he kept very carefully level, "Get me a full manifest on the Vorkai species. And someone tell navigation to plot a course for Crestfall, Colonial Sector 7. He paused. Fastest available. His second-in-command, a Ulhari named Dret who was young and efficient and had the compact, exoskeletal build of his species, blue-gray plating, compound eyes that caught light like mirrors, pulled up the codex entry on the Vorkai and went very still while he read it. Then he looked at Osei and said, "Sir, should I prepare the heavy containment equipment?" Osei said, "Prepare everything." Across the patrol vessel, in a small research cabin packed with instruments and specimen cases and data slates stacked in piles that defied structural logic, a woman named Dr. Lien Voss intercepted the alert through a research feed she was not technically supposed to have access to, but had maintained for 3 years without anyone bothering to stop her. She was human, late 30s, with the focused and slightly distracted look of someone whose mind was almost always working on 2 things at once. She had dedicated the last 6 years of her career to the study of Vorkai, their biology, their acoustic patterns, their social structure, based entirely on remains and recordings, because no living Vorkai had ever been observed in a non-hostile context. She read the alert 3 times. Then she picked up her comm and called Commander Osei directly and told him she needed to be on the ground team. She expected an argument. Osei, who had learned through experience that arguing with Dr. Voss was less efficient than simply allowing her to do what she was going to do anyway, said, "Be at the shuttle bay in 20 minutes. She was there in 11. Back on Crestfall, Reed Calloway knew none of this. He had spent the morning doing what needed to be done. He had gone into the shed and found the old medical kit from his service days, the one he had never thrown away because he had never been able to think of a good reason to. He had cleaned and applied antiseptic to the tear in the creature's fan ear, working slowly, talking in that same low river of sound he had used the night before. The creature, which he had begun, privately, and without making a decision about it, to call Dusk, had tolerated the process with the flat patience of something that was too tired to object. The leg injury was older than the ear. There was scar tissue around it that told him it had been healing on its own, imperfectly. He cleaned it and let it be. Some things you did not push. In the afternoon, the colony administrator came out to his property with 2 settlers behind her, both of them standing at a distance that suggested they had come along more out of obligation than genuine desire to be near the situation. Hadley herself was braver. She stood at the fence line and looked at Dusk, who was lying on Reed's porch in the shade, and then looked at Reed. She said, "Reed, that is a Vorkai." He said, "I know." She said, "You understand what that means." He said, "It means it's been listed in the codex since the Orin 4 incident. I read the update when it came through." He looked at her. "It also means there's one lying on my porch that hasn't killed anything." Hadley looked at the creature. It opened one amber eye, regarded her, and closed it again. One of the settlers behind her made a sound that was not quite a word. She said, "The GSA is going to send someone." Reed said, "I expect they will." Hadley stood at the fence for another moment, looking at Dusk, looking at Reed, trying to find an argument that would work on a man who had survived 3 wars and currently appeared less concerned about the apex predator on his property than she was about the transmission costs of the GSA call. She did not find one. She said, "Be careful, Reed." He said, "I'm always careful." She did not believe him, but she went back to the colony because there was nothing else to do. That evening, Reed sat on the porch again. Dusk had moved from the shade to the edge of the porch steps, where it could see the yard and the tree both, and it lay there with its chin on its forepaws and its filaments running their slow violet pulse. Its fan ears turned at small sounds, a distant settler's vehicle, wind in the silver trees, the clicking of the heating unit. Reed watched the sky and thought about nothing in particular. Then the shuttle broke atmosphere. He heard it before he saw it. A high, thin sound that changed to a low-pressure roar as it descended. It came in from the north, a GSA configuration, running its approach lights in the dark. It was big enough to carry a containment team. Dusk heard it too. Both sets of ears came up at once, the pointed ones and the fan-shaped ones, all four fully raised, the filaments brightening from a slow pulse to a steady glow. It got to its feet and stood at the edge of the porch steps, watching the light cross the sky. Reed reached out and put his hand flat on the creature's side. He felt the tension in the muscle there, the coiled readiness of something that had survived by knowing when to run and when to fight. He said, "Easy." He did not know if the word meant anything to it. But the filaments dimmed, slowly, back to their resting pulse. And Dusk stood still, watching the shuttle descend, with Reed's hand resting on its flank in the dark. 8 soldiers stepping off a shuttle in full tactical gear make a specific kind of sound, the compressed rhythm of boots, equipment, and purpose, moving in a formation that says without words, "We have come to handle something." Commander Osei led them off the ramp and onto the soil of Crestfall in the early morning light, and he took in the frontier colony around him, the low buildings, the amber plains, the silver trees in the distance. And he took in the group of nervous-looking colonists watching from a distance, and he did not let any of what he was feeling show in his face or his posture, because that was his job. Dr. Voss stepped off the ramp behind the soldiers and immediately pulled out 3 instruments at once and looked in 6 directions. The colony administrator, Hadley, met them at the edge of the landing area. She was the kind of person who got straight to the point, which Osei respected. She told him the creature had been on the property of a resident named Reed Calloway for 5 days. She told him there had been no attacks, no aggressive displays, no damage to colony property. She said the word, however, and then paused in a way that suggested the next part was the part she had been struggling to explain over the comm. Osei said, "Just tell me." Hadley said, "It follows him around." There was a brief silence. Dret, standing just behind Osei's right shoulder, said nothing, but his compound eyes shifted in a way that, on a Ulhuri, indicated something between confusion and deep professional unease. Hadley took them along the eastern edge of the colony toward the cabin. She explained Reed Calloway on the way, service record, years on Crestfall, the general character of a man who had seen too much to make a fuss about things. Osei listened and said nothing. Dr. Voss walked slightly ahead of everyone else, recording ambient data with an instrument she held out in front of her like a torch. They came around the last building, and the cabin came into view, and Osei stopped walking. He had read the codex entry on the Vorkai 3 times during the flight. He had reviewed the incident reports from the abandoned colonies. He had looked at the photographs, the deep scoring in reinforced walls, the accounts from survivors, the thermal imaging that showed the creatures moving through darkness as though they owned it. He had prepared himself, in the way a professional prepares for something, to see a dangerous animal. He had not prepared himself to see it lying on a porch like a dog. It was on its side, one leg extended, the long tail curled loosely around it. The filaments along its body ran a slow, rhythmic pulse of violet light, the way something pulses when it is deeply, genuinely asleep. Its eyes were closed. Reed Calloway was sitting beside it in a chair with a cup in his hand, watching Osei's group approach with the calm expression of a man watching weather come in from a distance and finding it interesting. Osei heard someone in his unit make a sound. He did not look to see who. He walked to the fence line, stopped, and looked at the old man, and then at the creature, and then at the old man again. He said, "Mr. Calloway." Reed said, "Commander." He pronounced it with the flat ease of someone who had used the rank himself for a long time. "You made good time." Osei said, "We have a Tier 1 designation on that animal." Reed said, "I know." Osei said, "I need you to understand the level of threat that." Reed said, 3 wars, Commander. 2 of them on border planets with fauna that makes the Codex look like a children's guide. I understand the threat level." He looked at Dusk, sleeping beside his chair. I also understand what I'm looking at. Behind Osei, Dredd had brought his weapon to a low-ready position, not raised, but not at rest. Dusk was asleep. Then Dusk was not asleep. The fan ears rose first, then the pointed ears, and the amber eyes opened, and the filaments went from a slow pulse to a bright and steady glow in the space of a breath. It was on its feet before Osei's unit had processed that it had moved. It stood at the edge of the porch and looked at Dredd. Dredd stood where he was and looked back, and to his considerable credit, he did not fire. He also did not lower the weapon. Reed stood up from his chair. He did not rush. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who knew that the next 10 seconds mattered and that rushing would ruin them. He put himself slightly between Dusk and the fence, not blocking the view, just shifting the geometry of the moment. He said, "Lower it." He said it the way an order is given when it is not a request, not loud, not aggressive, just certain. Dredd looked at Osei. Osei held up one hand. Dredd lowered the weapon. The filaments on Dusk did not immediately dim. The creature held its position on the porch steps, watching the unit with those amber eyes moving slowly from person to person, reading them the way an intelligent predator reads a situation. Then it looked at Reed. Then it lay back down, not all the way onto its side as before, but settled, chin up, watching, present. Osei let out a breath he had been holding. He said, "Mr. Calloway, I need you to surrender the animal for containment." Reed said, "No." Osei said, "That is not a request." Reed said, "And that's not a refusal based on sentiment. I'm telling you practically, that animal is not restrained. I have not captured it. It is on my property of its own choice. If your unit goes in there to take it, you will lose people. I'd rather you didn't lose people. So the answer is no." Dr. Voss, who had been standing at the back of the group with her instruments running, now walked forward until she was standing beside Osei at the fence. She had not asked permission to do this. She looked at Dusk with an expression that was very difficult to categorize, something between scientific hunger and something more personal. She said, quietly, to Reed, "How long did it take? Before it let you close?" Reed thought about it. He said, "About an hour before it came out of the trees. Another day before I got near the ear." She said, "The ear injury." He said, "Torn. Healing fine now." She said, "You treated it." He said, "Someone had to." She kept looking at Dusk. Dusk looked back at her. The fan ears tilted, one toward her, one still tracking the rest of the unit. After a silence that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, Dusk looked away, back toward the treeling. Dr. Voss exhaled in a slow, controlled way that fooled no one. She said to Osei, "I want to observe." Osei said, "Voss." She said, "A living Vorkai in a non-aggressive state. In 6 years of research, I have never had access to a living specimen. If you order containment and something goes wrong, we lose it. If we observe, we learn something that changes everything we think we know about this species." She paused. "You know I'm right." Osei stood at the fence for a long moment. He looked at the creature. He looked at the old man. He thought about the Orin 4 reports and the 31 soldiers and the footnote in the codex, and then he thought about the fact that the creature was currently lying on a porch in a frontier colony and the man beside it was drinking from a cup. He said, 48 hours. Observation only. We maintain the perimeter." He looked at Reed. "If it moves toward the colony, I pull the order." Reed said, "Fair enough." The perimeter went up at a respectful distance, 3 sensor posts and 2 guards on rotation. The unit set up a temporary post near the shuttle. Dredd was assigned the first watch on the east side, which put him with a clear line of sight to Reed's property. He stood his post with his hands at his sides and watched Dusk for a very long time. Night came quickly on Crestfall. The amber plains went dark and the silver trees became shapes, and the only light was the colony behind them and the steady violet glow from the creature on the porch. Dredd watched that glow and tried to calculate it the way he had been trained to calculate threats, distance, response time, the angle of approach if the animal charged. He went through it 4 times. He came up with the same answer 4 times. Insufficient reaction window. Then he stopped calculating and just watched. The glow pulsed slowly. The creature had not moved in an hour. The old man's cabin light had gone off. Dredd stood in the dark and watched a Tier 1 predator sleep, and he thought about the way it had looked at him when he raised his weapon, and then about the way it had simply looked away when the weapon was lowered, as though it had assessed him, found him manageable, and moved on. It had looked away first. He was still thinking about that when the first watch ended and someone came to relieve him. Dr. Voss had not slept. This was not unusual for her when she was working on something that mattered. But even by her own standards, this particular night had been excessive. She had sat at the fence post nearest Reed's property from the time the perimeter went up until the gray light of Crestfall's morning began washing out the violet glow of dusk's filaments. And she had recorded everything. The breathing pattern, the ear movement, the intervals between filament pulses, the way the creature shifted its weight and repositioned itself twice in the night in a way that said it was sleeping genuinely and not resting lightly. She had 4 data slates full of observations that represented, conservatively, more information about living Vorkai behavior than the entire academic literature currently contained. She was also running on pure focus and the kind of energy that comes not from rest, but from the feeling that you are, for the first time in years, exactly where you were supposed to be. Reed came out of the cabin in the early morning with 2 cups. He walked to the fence and held one through the gap. Dr. Voss looked at it. She looked at him. He said, "You look like you've been up all night." She said, "I have been up all night." He said, "Then take the cup." She took it. It was something hot and bitter and good, and she wrapped both hands around it and looked over at Dusk, who was now awake and sitting up, watching her with those amber eyes in the way it had been doing since it decided she was not an immediate problem, with a kind of focused, intelligent attention that made her feel, every time, like she was being read. She said, "When you first saw it, were you afraid?" Reed thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things. He said, "Not the way you mean. There was a moment where something in me said, pay attention, this is real. But fear, no. I've been afraid before. I know what it feels like. This wasn't that." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because it hadn't done anything to me yet. Most things don't, if you give them the space not to." She looked at him. She said, "That's not how most species think about Vorkai." He said, "Most species haven't been living with wolves for 40,000 years." She almost said something and then stopped. She looked at Dusk again. She said, more carefully, "Tell me about that." So he told her. He told her about the dog he had when he was a boy, a large, half-wild thing his family had found injured near their property on Earth and taken in, and that had taken 3 months before it would eat from a hand rather than a bull set at distance, and another month after that before it would allow anyone closer than arm's reach. He told her about the border world of his second deployment, where the local Delani settlers thought the human soldiers were either very stupid or very insane for attempting to approach the feral dog packs that lived near the forward base. He told her that within 6 months, 2 of those dogs were sleeping inside the base perimeter, and the local settlers had stopped trying to understand it and started simply accepting it. He said, "It's in us. Not just the history of it, it's wired in. The patience, the instinct to reach towards something dangerous and see if it wants to be reached toward." He looked at Dusk. Other species don't have that the same way. They see danger and they make a sensible decision. We see danger and something in us asks, "But what is it? What does it want? Is it something we can sit with?" He drank from his cup. "It's probably a design flaw, honestly," Dr. Voss said, "or it's why you're still here." He looked at her. He didn't argue. She told him what she knew about Vorkai, the parts she had spent 6 years building from secondhand material. Pack animals, deeply hierarchical, with social structures that bore similarities to wolves in their ranking behaviors, but more complex emotional signaling. The filaments were mood indicators, she believed, not just threat displays. The attacks on the mining colonies were almost certainly territorial, she said, probably following geological disruption that altered the boundaries of established pack ranges. Not mindless violence. Displaced and defending. Reed listened to all of this and said, "So it came out here looking for somewhere safe." She said, "I think so, yes." He said, "And it found somewhere." There was a quiet between them. Then Dusk stood up from the porch and walked down the steps and across the yard, slowly, and stopped at the fence where they were standing. Dr. Voss went very still. Dusk looked at her for a long time, nose forward, pulling air, reading whatever it was that Vorkai read in the scent of a person. One fan, ear tilted toward her. The filaments went to a steady, calm pulse. Then Dusk pushed its narrow muzzle gently through the gap in the fence and sniffed at the cup in Dr. Voss's hands. She did not move. Reed, beside her, also did not move, though she saw in her peripheral vision that the corner of his mouth shifted slightly. Dusk withdrew, looked at her one more time with those amber eyes, turned, and walked back to the porch. Dr. Voss looked down at her cup. She said, very quietly, It came to me. Reed said, You've been sitting at this fence all night. You were a fact to it. A consistent, non-threatening fact. He paused. That's all it needed. Her eyes were doing something she was not going to acknowledge, so she kept them on her cup and let the moment be what it was. Later in the afternoon, Osei came to stand beside Reed at the fence on his own, without the unit, which told Reed more about the man than anything the commander had said so far. He asked questions carefully, not about containment protocol, not about the codex, but about what Reed had actually done in those first hours. Reed answered him the same way he answered Dr. Voss, plainly, without drama. Then Osei said, with the look of a man deciding to say something he had not planned to, On my home world, there was a bird. Large, built like a raptor, completely wild. The old story said it could not be approached, could not be tamed. It killed 2 men in my grandfather's village who tried to drive it from a nesting site. He was quiet for a moment. My grandfather had one, eventually. It lived on the roof of his home for 11 years. He never told anyone how he managed it. When I was young, I thought he was simply unusual. Reed said, And now? Osei said, Now I think he was patient. He looked at Dusk. How did you know it wouldn't attack that first night? Reed said, I didn't. Osei looked at him. Reed said, But it was hurt, and it was starving, and it chose to come out of the trees instead of going back into them. Something in it made that choice. I didn't know if it would attack. I just decided to trust whatever made it come out in the first place. He looked at Osei. Sometimes that's all you've got. Osei thought about this for a long time. Then he said, It looked away from Dret. Reed said, Yes. Osei said, He raised the weapon. It stood up and looked at him. He lowered the weapon. It looked away. Reed said, It tested him. He passed. Osei said, By lowering the weapon. Reed said, By not panicking. The weapon was just the sign of it. Osei looked at the creature, then back at Reed. He said, You people are very strange. I mean that carefully. Reed said, I know. We've been told. Near sunset, Dret approached Reed alone. He stood at a slightly awkward angle that Reed recognized as the posture of someone who wanted to ask something and was managing the pride required to do so. Reed waited. Dret said, If it approaches me, what do I do? Reed said, Stand still. Breathe slowly. Look somewhere near it rather than directly at it. When it looks at you, don't stare back. Let your eyes drop, briefly, just for a second. Then you can look again. Dret said, That signals submission. Reed said, It signals that you're not a threat. There's a difference. He looked at the young soldier. Your threat posture is already dealt with. You lowered the weapon. That was the big thing. The rest is just consistency. Dret was quiet. Then he said, I was afraid. Reed said, Of course you were. It's a Vorkai. Dret said, I didn't lower the weapon because I wasn't afraid. I lowered it because you told me to. Reed said, I know. And it understood the result, not the reason. That's enough. Dret stood there for another moment, looking at Dusk, who was sitting at the edge of the porch watching the sky change color. The filaments were running a deep, slow violet in the evening light. Beautiful, like something lit from inside. Dret said, It is nothing like the Codex photographs. Reed said, No. Photographs are usually taken after something has gone wrong. This is what they look like when nothing is going wrong. Dret looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he straightened, nodded once in Reed's direction, and went back to his post. And for the rest of that evening, when Dusk walked the fence line in its slow, curious way, not aggressive, just moving, just looking, Dret stood his ground. His hands were at his sides. His breathing was measured. When Dusk passed within 3 feet of him and paused to look at him, he let his eyes drop for one brief second. Dusk moved on. Dret stood very still for a moment after it passed, as though he needed a second to confirm to himself that he was still standing. Then he straightened his shoulders and kept his watch, and no one who was looking at him would have been able to see in his posture anything other than a soldier doing his job. But something had shifted in him, quietly, in the dark, in the space of a 3-foot gap and a briefly lowered gaze. And he would not be entirely the same person he had been when he stepped off that shuttle. It was the sensor post on the northern side of the perimeter that picked it up first, and the soldier monitoring it did what he was trained to do, which was to call it in immediately and clearly without any additional commentary. What he called in was large biological mass, moving through the silver tree forest from the north, heading south toward the colony. Estimated size, significantly larger than the known specimen. That word, larger, traveled from the northern sensor post to the command tent in approximately 4 seconds, and from the command tent it went to Osei, and from Osei it went to every member of the unit at once, and then the entire perimeter shifted from a state of watchful quiet to a state of sharp and complete readiness. Dr. Voss, who had finally slept a few hours in the early morning and was now back at the fence with fresh instruments, heard the call go through on her comm. She pulled up the sensor feed on her data slate and looked at the thermal signature moving through the trees and said, very quietly to herself, Alpha. She recognized it from the scale of it. The reports from Orin 4 described the pack alphas as significantly larger than the juveniles and subadults, heavier through the chest, longer in the tail, with a pelt so dense with bioluminescent filaments that thermal imaging often showed them as a solid glow rather than a distinct shape. What was on her screen was a solid glow. She said, louder, Commander, do not engage. Osei was already at the sensor post. He said, without looking at her, give me a reason. She said, it's tracking the younger one, the one on Reed's property. It is almost certainly a pack finder, a senior animal sent to locate a missing member. If it finds the young one alive and in a non-hostile environment, it may simply take it and leave. She paused. If we engage, we tell it the colony is a threat. And then we have a very different situation. Osei said, and if it decides the colony is a threat regardless? She said, then we have the same situation either way, and we will have started it. Osei looked at the thermal feed for a moment. He said, get the colonists to the interior buildings. Quietly. No running. He looked at his unit. Weapons on standby. Nothing fires until I give the order. The evacuation of the outer buildings moved faster than Osei expected. Colonists who had been on a frontier settlement for any length of time had a practical relationship with danger, and the word Vorkai had been circulating since the day before. They moved. The settlement's eastern edge went quiet. Reed's cabin had no comm unit connected to the colony's alert system, because Reed had declined to connect it when he moved in, on the grounds that he had lived for 60-plus years without an alarm and saw no reason to start. So no alert reached him. What reached him was dusk. He was inside, cleaning up after a modest lunch, when he heard the change in the creature's behavior, a sound he had not heard before, low and resonant, vibrating below the range where language lived, more like a pressure change than a noise. He recognized it the way you recognize a tone in someone's voice that means something is different now. He set down what he was holding and went to the door. Dusk was standing at the top of the porch steps with its full size apparent in a way it rarely was, back straight, tail up, filaments blazing a bright and continuous violet that cast real light in the afternoon air. Not aggressive, not frightened, alert and present in the way a person stands when they see someone they have not seen in a long time. Reed looked north. He looked at the tree-line. The alpha came out of the trees the way a fact comes, without warning, without ceremony, already existing before you have had time to prepare for it. It was larger than dusk in every dimension, the chest heavier, the legs thicker, the muzzle broader, the filaments so dense along its body that it seemed, in the thin light, to give off its own illumination. Its pelt was the same dark violet black, but older, carrying the marks of years, a long-healed scar along its left shoulder, one fan ear with a notch at the top, the particular quality of something that had survived everything that had ever tried to stop it. It stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at Reed. Reed stood at the top of the porch steps. From the perimeter, barely visible at the distance, the GSA unit held its position. Osei had his hand raised. No one moved. Dusk made that low resonant sound again. The Alpha's head turned toward it. Something passed between them that had no translation, a communication in frequencies and filament light that was older than any language any species in the galaxy had invented. The Alpha looked at Dusk. Dusk looked back, filaments steady and bright. Then the Alpha looked at Reed again. It moved toward him, not fast, not slow, the deliberate pace of something that has decided to do something and is doing it. Behind the perimeter, at least 2 weapons came up. Osei's raised hand did not move. His jaw was tight. Reed stood where he was. He had thought about this, in the abstract, over the past few days, about what would happen when the pack came looking. He had known they would come. Animals like this did not leave their own behind. He had thought about what he would do, and the answer he had arrived at was the same answer he had arrived at on the first night, sitting in his chair while a beautiful and dangerous thing watched him from the tree line. Nothing. He would do nothing that he did not have to do. The Alpha stopped 3 feet in front of him. It was enormous at this distance. The top of its head came to Reed's chest, and its shoulders were broad enough that standing before it felt like standing before a wall that was also alive and very aware of you. Its amber eyes, lighter than dusk's, more gold than amber, the eyes of an older animal, looked at him without blinking. Reed looked back, not at its eyes directly, but at the space just beside them, the way he had told Dret. Not a stare, just a presence. He breathed slowly and let his hands stay loose at his sides, and he thought about nothing, which was something he had become very good at in the years after his service, when thinking about things had been more harmful than helpful. The Alpha lowered its head toward him. It sniffed him with the focused intensity of a creature for whom smell was the truest language. It went over his hands, his jacket, the side of his face, the same way a customs official goes through a case, looking for the thing that doesn't belong. It spent a long time at his hands, which smelled of antiseptic and the food he had fed Dusk and of Dusk itself. Then it raised its head. Then it looked at Dusk. Dusk made the low sound again, longer this time, and different in a way that Dr. Voss, watching from the perimeter with 4 instruments recording simultaneously in tears she was not acknowledging running silently down both cheeks, would later describe in her notes as, contextually, appeared to be a statement rather than a question, an answer given to something asked. The Alpha stood still for a moment. Then, slowly, with the weight of something that had made a decision, it lowered its head in Reed's direction. Not all the way, not submission, nothing so simple as that. A recognition, an acknowledgement, from one creature that had survived many things to another that had survived many things, that something had happened here that was not nothing. Then it turned and walked to the tree line and stopped, waiting. Dusk looked at Reed. Reed looked at Dusk. He thought about the first night, the violet glow in the trees, the water bowl, the cleaning cloth moving in slow circles across an already clean rifle. He thought about the torn ear and the careful antiseptic and the way the creature had lowered its chin to the ground and simply stayed when it could have run. He thought about 5 days, which was both a long time and no time at all. He crouched down slowly, the way his knees allowed him to these days, and put his hand between Dusk's ears, the wolf ears and the fan ears, all 4 warm under his palm. Dusk leaned into it for 1 moment. The filaments flared once, bright and full, and then settled. Then Dusk pulled back, gently, the way something moves when it is ready. It looked at the tree line. It looked at Reed. Reed said, "Go on, then." The same voice he had always used, low and even and unhurried. The voice of a man who did not need to make a moment bigger than it already was. Dusk went. It crossed the yard without looking back and passed through the fence gap and moved across the open ground to where the Alpha waited. They stood together for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, and then the silver trees took them, and they were gone. Reed stayed crouched for a moment. His knees told him to stand up, and he did so, slowly, and he looked at the tree line for a while. Then he turned around and walked back to the porch and picked up the cup he had left there, and found that it had gone cold sometime during the last 20 minutes. Behind the perimeter, no one moved and no one spoke. Dr. Voss stood with 4 instruments she had forgotten to look at, her notes open and blank, and looked at the empty yard and the silver trees, and she thought, in 6 years I have been waiting to learn something real about this species. And what I learned today has almost nothing to do with the species. Osei lowered his hand. He said, to no one in particular, very quietly, "Stand down." The unit stood down. Dret stood at the eastern post and looked at the tree line where the Vorkai had disappeared and thought about the way the large one, the Alpha, had stood before the old man and looked at him, and the old man had looked back, and neither of them had moved, and then the Alpha had lowered its head. He thought about what that meant and could not find the right category for it in any of his training, and finally stopped trying to put it in a category and just let it be what it was. Something had been witnessed here. He was not sure yet what it was, but he was certain it mattered. 3 weeks after the GSA shuttle lifted off from Harrow's Landing and Crestfall's amber planes went quiet again, a paper appeared in the joint xenobiology journal maintained by the Galactic Survey Authority's Research Division. It was 41 pages long, which was long even by the standards of that journal. Its author was Dr. Lien Voss, and its title was Toward a Revised Behavioral Assessment of the Vorkai Species, Field Observations from a Non-Hostile Contact Event. In the broader academic world, papers took months or years to circulate. This one moved faster. Within a week of publication, it had been accessed more times than any paper in the journal's 12-year history. Within 2 weeks, it had been cited in a formal petition to the GSA Research Council requesting a review of the Vorkai's Tier 1 Hazard Codex designation, the first such petition in 60 years. Within 3 weeks, a panel had been convened, reluctantly, because the petition was technically correct in every cited source and none of the council members could find legitimate grounds to dismiss it. Dr. Voss did not attend the convening. She was back on Crestfall. She had not planned to return so quickly. She had told herself she would go back to her research post, organize her notes, begin the formal write-up of the longer study she intended to pursue. She had done all of those things, and then she had booked transit back to Crestfall on the first available carrier, and she had been honest enough with herself not to be surprised by this. Reed met her at the edge of his property, the way he had met Osei and the unit 3 weeks earlier, standing at the fence with a cup in his hand, watching her come down the path with the easy patience of a man who had time and was not bothered about it. She said, "I wanted to check on how you were managing." He said, "The heating unit needed a part. I ordered it. Other than that, fine." She said, and she looked at the empty porch, the empty yard, the fence where she had spent a night recording a living Vorkai and feeling, for the first time in years, like her work was what it was supposed to be. He said, "No, nothing since." She nodded. She had not expected otherwise. She pulled out a data slate and showed him the paper. He read the title, looked at her, and read it again. He said, "You put all of it in?" She said, "Everything I could observe and measure. The acoustic recordings, the filament light analysis, the behavioral sequence from initial contact to pack retrieval." She paused. "I also included a section on the methodology of the initial contact. What you actually did, in order, with the rationale as you described it to me." He said, "You wrote up my methodology." She said, "I cited it as the foundational approach of the study." "Yes." He looked at the data slate for a moment. Then he said, "I was just sitting in a chair." She said, "I know. That's what makes it significant." He handed the slate back, and they stood at the fence in the way they had during those 2 days, companionably, without needing to fill the air. After a while she asked if she could come in and sit on the porch, and he opened the gate and let her in, and they sat together in the afternoon in chairs that were not both the same height, and she asked him questions that were partly scientific and partly not, and he answered them the same way he answered everything, without hurry, without performance. He told her about the print. He said it was 2 days after the shuttle left. He had come out in the early morning to find it pressed into the mud at the edge of the yard. One single Vorkai print, large, the talons clearly defined. It had not been there the evening before. Something had come in the night, made one deliberate impression, and left. Dr. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her data slate and typed a note to herself. She said, "There's no literature on intentional marking behavior in Vorkai outside of territorial boundaries." Reed said, "Maybe this is a different kind of boundary." She looked at him. He was looking at the tree, holding his cup, in the way he always seemed to be, present and unhurried, and somehow slightly ahead of whatever the rest of the world was trying to figure out. Far above Crestfall's atmosphere, in the Sector 7 patrol corridor, Commander Osei was writing his formal mission report. He had been writing it for 3 weeks, which was longer than it had ever taken him to write a mission report, because every time he thought he had described what happened accurately, he read it back and felt that it was not accurate enough. Not inaccurate in its facts, but incomplete in some way he found difficult to name. He had written, "The Vorkai specimen on the Callaway property was observed to display sustained non-aggressive behavior over a period of 5 days in proximity to a human resident." He had written, The pack retrieval event on day 6 demonstrated that the specimen's presence on the property did not constitute territorial claim by the pack, and that the pack alpha's behavior toward the human resident was consistent with. And here he had stopped, and started again, and stopped again. Consistent with what? Recognition was the word he kept returning to. But recognition implied a certain kind of understanding, and writing that a Tier 1 predator had understood something about an old human man felt like the kind of sentence that would get a report sent back for revision. He wrote it anyway. Corporal Drett's addendum to the mission report was 3 paragraphs long, which was unusual. Soldiers of his rank in the Ulhari Corps did not typically file addenda. His commanding officer had read it twice and approved it without comment, because the 3 paragraphs were written in direct, unembellished language that said exactly what had happened and nothing else, and there was nothing in the regulations that required him to suppress that. The addendum described Drett standing at the eastern perimeter post. It described the Vorkai approaching to within 3 feet and pausing. It described, in the precise language of a military report, the behavioral sequence Reed Calloway had recommended: stillness, measured breathing, the brief lowering of the eyes. It described the Vorkai moving on. The final sentence of the addendum read, "I have submitted a transfer request to the Xenofauna Research Division, citing the observations of this mission as the basis for my interest." His commanding officer had added one note beneath this: approved. Effective next rotation. Back in Harrow's Landing, the colony had resumed its rhythms. Settlers who had rushed to the interior buildings on the day of the Alpha's appearance now walked the eastern fields again and looked at the silver trees, sometimes in a way that was different from before. The fear was not entirely gone. It was not the kind of thing that went entirely, but it had been mixed with something else, the way a color changes when you add another color to it. The story was everywhere. A veteran and a Vorkai. The creature that the Codex said was uncontainable, sleeping in the sun. Petra, the 8-year-old who had seen it first and run back to the colony and set all of this in motion, had told the story so many times by now that she had the timing of it right. The part where she looked up from chasing the hopper, the part where she saw the creature following the old man like a slow dark shadow. She had been told by 3 separate adults that she should not have been at the eastern fence by herself, which she agreed with out loud and ignored internally, because the eastern fence was where the interesting things were. She also went there now and stood on her own, sometimes, and looked at the silver trees, and thought about the violet glow she had glimpsed from far away on that first morning. Faint and beautiful, pulsing like something alive, which it had been. One morning, 6 weeks after the shuttle left, Reed came out of his cabin before the light had fully come up. The air was cold, and the amber plains were gray in the pre-dawn. He went to the edge of the yard and looked at the ground. The print was there, fresh, clean, pressed into the same spot as the one from before. One print. The talons precisely placed. He stood over it for a long time. Long enough for the light to change and the silver trees to go from gray shapes to silver shapes, and for the first thin bird calls to start in the high branches. He looked at the tree-line. He did not see anything. The trees were still and quiet and full of their ordinary morning sounds. Nothing moved in the shadows between them. No violet light. No amber eyes. He looked at the print. He went inside and put the kettle on. While the water heated, he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard, at the print in the mud, at the fence line and the open ground and the silver trees beyond. The heating unit clicked on. The kettle began its slow approach to ready. He poured himself something hot and took it to the porch and sat in the chair with the cracked armrest he had never gotten around to fixing, and he looked at the tree-line for a while. It looked back at him the way it always did, full of its own life, its own deep quiet, its own business that had nothing to do with him, and also, in some way he could not entirely explain, something to do with him now. He took a slow sip. The birds were singing. All of them, the thin whistlers and the low hummers and the distant calls of the larger things in the undergrowth. All of them going about their morning as though the world was ordinary, which in most ways it was. Reed sat on his porch and drank his cup and listened to them. He had no plans for the day worth mentioning. The heating unit part had finally arrived, and he would fit it at some point. There was a section of fence that wanted attention near the northern corner. Otherwise, nothing particular, just the morning and the cold air and the print in the mud and the silver trees at the edge of the world holding whatever they held. He had lived long enough to know that some things did not require a conclusion. Some things were simply ongoing, a line that did not end but continued beyond where you could see it, around some bend in the distance, still moving. You did not need to follow it to know that it was there. He sat. The print in the mud held its shape. The trees were still. Somewhere in the silver forest, if you were the kind of person who looked at the right things in the right way, there was a faint violet light moving through the undergrowth, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat, like something at rest. And the morning went on.